Good evening. For those who are joining us online, it is our first, or should I say, it is our last talk of the 6 talks we had for COP26. And I have the great pleasure to have with us someone called Alex Thom, who is going to tell us about the perspective of the oil and gas industry regarding green industry, green energy. Over the last few days, over the last few weeks, maybe a few months, the oil and gas industry have been the boogeyman of the debate on climate change. So we felt it was important to hear as well from this industry, who represent a fair number of people, livelihood, and this is why we're delighted to have Alex with us. But I'm going to put the scene by asking the first question. What does just transition means, and is it achievable? Alex.
Thank you. Thank you, Laurent, and thank you for the opportunity to be here this evening. I'm really pleased to have the chance to make the debate balanced, although it's the first time I've ever been introduced as the bogeyman. So I'm Alex Thom, as Laurent has said, and I work for an organisation called OG UK, or as we were called, Oil and Gas UK. Most people still call us that, actually. And that's a trade association which represents about 400 member companies who are active in the North Sea. So that's all of the operators and the super majors, the people you've heard of, like BP and Shell, Total, but also the major contractors, right through to niche manufacturers, lawyers and support services, shipping companies, drillers, etc. And I'm also a Methodist local preacher. So back to your question, Laurent, and it's a great question. And I think I'd start off by saying that for a just transition to take place, there has to be a great new future to transition into. And I think we all agree, wherever we are in this debate, that the future must be different to the way that it is today. And as for being just, to my mind, and my faith has a lot to do with this, is it's about not leaving anyone behind. And in fact, that's certainly our industry mantra, that it's important we don't repeat the lessons from coal mining, for example, and we leave thousands of workers without jobs and communities without a central source of income. And we need to make sure that our lifestyle doesn't come at the cost of that of others. So I'd like to start by saying that we in the oil and gas industry very firmly believe that we are part of the solution. And for us, it's not either or, and disappointingly, that's way too often the debate, but we believe, and there's a lot of evidence to support us, I think, that it's and. We were one of the first industries to welcome the setting of net zero targets of 2050 in the UK and 2045 in Scotland, of course. And the sector can contribute to the energy transition by firstly reducing its own emissions, but also playing a leading role in enabling those technologies that reduce emissions from use or consumption of oil and gas, or serve as low carbon alternatives. So we can think here about the emerging technologies of carbon capture and storage and hydrogen, as well as renewables such as solar and wind. And the Climate Change Committee report recognises the major contribution that the sector will make to net zero, and we will continue to provide a significant share of a more diverse energy mix to 2050 and beyond. So if you look at the report and see the figures of oil and gas consumption going through to 2050, you will see that it continues right to then, and we certainly won't be meeting all of the UK's demand, and we're not meeting all of the UK's demand now. We mustn't forget the economic benefits either. We contribute about 1.2% to the UK GDP, provide 45% of the primary energy. In the taxi from the station here, I was talking to the driver who raised the issue of tax. We've paid £350 billion in production taxes alone, so that's not without corporation tax or indeed employment taxes. And we currently support about 120,000 jobs, and that's not including those induced jobs that arise as a result of spend in communities. If we think of it in Scotland, we contribute about 12% of GDP and support 50,000 jobs. Let's look at a bit of context. We don't operate in isolation, and we're legally required to maximise economic recovery from the basin. That's regulated by the government regulator, the Oil and Gas Authority, in the Energy Act. Now, they've updated their strategy to ensure that maximising economic recovery, while still an obligation, is done in the context of net zero. But let's not forget, that is a legal obligation on our oil and gas community. Secondly, demand is not going away. And while we use oil and gas, and we're going to continue to do so, let's produce it here from our domestic resources. It provides security of supply. It means that we can manage emissions, and I'll come on to that in a moment, whereas if we're importing it, we have no say over how that's produced. And indeed, shipping it is in itself inefficient. And we support jobs and taxes. But I'd say again, demand is not going away. We don't produce oil and gas for the sake of it. We absolutely need it. And we tend to focus in the debate on hydrocarbons as fuel, but there are so many other uses that people either aren't aware of or don't think of. So if we think about our day-to-day when we got up, I'm assuming we brushed our teeth using toothpaste from a plastic tube, a toothbrush that was probably plastic, put milk from a plastic carton on our cereal or in our tea or coffee. We had a nice warm shower, more than likely powered by gas. 83% of homes are heated by gas currently. Maybe checked our mobile phone, tick, another 6 litres of oil. And then wherever we had to get to, we used some form of transport, which requires a fuel of some sort. And even if it was an electric car or an electric bike, there's oil in tyres and in tarmac on the roads. We need oil for medicines, fertilisers, pharmaceuticals. There's oil contained in solar panels. We need oil as a lubricant in wind turbines. I'd say again, it's not either or, it's and. And we are an industry in transition, and we're working hard to decarbonise our own sector. So if we look at the emissions that we produce ourselves in the production of oil and gas, the biggest cause of emissions is from power generation to run our offshore platforms. And I'd just take a moment to acknowledge the level of engineering and technology that is in the industry. It's stuff that would make NASA blush, it really would. And we should remember the achievements that we as a country have reached in developing the industry. But we need to decarbonise our own sector, so we're reducing emissions from power generation by looking at electrification. So that means we'll try and remove the power generators that are out there where it's economically viable to do so, and replace them with electrification, which means ostensibly building a wind farm to power the platforms and manage production. That in itself is going to be a huge, huge investment, and we are talking billions of pounds. We're very heavily supporting carbon capture and storage, which is essential, everyone agrees, and the development of hydrogen as a fuel. Now they're both some way off. The numbers of people working in those at the moment, despite the huge numbers potentially in the future, are quite small because they're still at sort of front-end engineering conceptual studies, but with Every single cluster around the country that is looking at carbon capture and hydrogen has oil companies heavily involved. So in Aberdeen, the Acorn cluster, which some of you may have read about, which sadly lost out on the Track 1 government investment, that's Shell and Siccar Point. In Teesside, it's BP, for example. So oil and gas companies are at the forefront of developing these things which are essential to decarbonising our economy. As well as carbon capture and hydrogen, they're investing heavily in wind. They're amongst the largest bidders in the latest round of ScotWind, tidal power, solar and geothermal, which we don't hear much about at the moment, but we will. And these investments are not new. It's not happened in the last 2 or 3 years. I used to work for BP, and we were looking at and developing experimental solar farms nigh on 20 years ago. And there were efforts made to develop a carbon capture project at Peterhead using the power station in the Millerfield, but government funding was withdrawn, and the same thing happened to Shell a few years later. So this is not a new conversation, is what I'm trying to say. So we're applying our skills and our resources to the diversification and the export of skills and protecting jobs. And many of our major contractors are already deploying some of their workforce in wind farms or the emerging carbon capture sector, for example. So we're upskilling the workforce and improving the means of transferring people between different energy sectors. But we have to recognise that is going to take time. So we need to, for the transition to be a just transition, we need to make sure that it's well managed. And that's a large part of my role at OG UK at the moment, where we're looking to ensure that as oil and gas runs down, and it surely will, it's a finite resource, that we are ready to move people and transition them across in a managed way to the emerging sectors. We need to be realistic. Not everyone is going to get a job from oil and gas in wind, for example. There's not going to be one for one. But there are a number of other sectors, and we're also talking to nuclear about how can we ensure that we can move people between places and make sure employment is protected. And it's going to require policy measures from government. We need to get permission to repurpose assets for carbon capture and storage under the North Sea. We need policies and regulation for the carbon capture and hydrogen and developed markets, of course, because they're just emerging. But a shout out for Aberdeen having 12 hydrogen buses. And they've just announced, actually, the City Council, an alliance with BP to develop a hydrogen hub. We've set our target of becoming a net zero emissions basin by 2050. We've set ambitious targets which we're on track to meet. If you want to read more about it, you can look at our Energy Transition Outlook report, which you can find on our website. So we're targeting 50% reduction by 2030, 90% by 2040, but we've also got short-term targets, so 10% by 2025, which we're already well on the way to meeting, and 25% by 2027. As I said earlier, we're meeting about 50% at the moment of oil and gas demands from domestic production in the UK. So we're minimising imports, but that's going to fall off. And the less we invest in the North Sea, the quicker that is going to diminish. We're never going to be in the position of producing more oil and gas than we use. And you may hear some people saying, well, we're exporting oil, so we must be producing too much. That is a matter of the size of the molecules, actually. Not all oil is equal. So different kinds of oil, light, medium or heavy, have different uses. So that's why we export some and import others. We're also growing and diversifying our supply chain with a view to exporting their skills, their expertise, and becoming world leaders in wind and tidal, as we have the opportunity to be in carbon capture. So it's an opportunity for the whole of the UK economy, not just for oil and gas. By continuing on the planned path that we have, we believe in 2030 we'll still have 100,000 direct and indirect jobs, and that's not including carbon capture and hydrogen. And through technology and innovation, we believe it's possible to create over £10 billion in economic value. It's a really ambitious plan, but it's got industry support and it's got government support. And a lot of it has been encapsulated in the North Sea Transition Deal, which was an agreement made between the UK government and our sector, and outlines specific actions which we will be measured against, including electrification, carbon capture, and development of hydrogen, and making sure that people's jobs are protected, that jobs that are created are quality jobs with security and development opportunities. So we are being held to account. And that's been supported by the Scottish Government too. But let's think for a moment, if those who are calling for us to cease production get their way, what might that look like? Well, we could look to see civil unrest, not just here, if that may seem unthinkable, but if we've got power shortages, fuel shortages, thousands of job losses, if we imagine what was on our streets, or not imagine, remember what was on our streets at the time of the miners' strike, and when that was over, and in less stable economies, you're going to see that even more. We'll see parts of the developing world condemned to energy poverty, or they will begin to burn coal again, which we're trying to eradicate, and have made big inroads there. So surely other parts of the world have the right to expect a standard of living equivalent to ours. And if we pull the rug out from under them, that is going to be even more of a challenge than it already is. As I've said previously, if we don't meet the demand, because we don't create the demand, but if we don't meet the demand, then someone else will, and we'll be relying on imports, which isn't good for our economy, and we could have higher emissions because we can't control how that oil and gas will be produced, and you'll have the emissions from shipping without the benefits of jobs and contribution to the economy from tax. Realistically, the UK industry, we must remember, is only 1% of the global industry. But there are other ways for us here to show leadership, and which is why we've developed the roadmap that I've described out to 2035 and the North Sea Transition Deal. And if we can be a beacon and have that replicated by bigger emitters, then it really can move the dial. As my taxi driver said tonight, if China and India and other major emitters don't change, we might as well forget it. I wouldn't agree with that, but it's on the right track. We'll see literally hundreds of thousands of job losses, and loss of the feedstock for essential things like medical equipment. You know, some of our companies turned their hand to making ventilators at the height of the pandemic, or donated PPE, or developed specialist PPE. Like it or not, we can't do without plastic at the moment. We need fertilisers, I've mentioned tyres, mobile phones, etc. It's going to take time to find substitutes for all of those things. And we're well placed as an industry to become world leaders in mitigation programmes like carbon capture. We've got the skills, the capability, and we're blessed here with the geology. We've got massive caverns that we've been sucking stuff out of under the North Sea, and we can use the skills that we've got. Our geologists can be just as good at telling us how to put stuff back in. We can actually be an importer of CO2, and that's something else that's on the cards. And practically, the infrastructure to close down our industry now is simply not there. We don't have good enough public transport. We don't have sufficient charging points for electric cars. And while we think about electric cars, we still need tyres, you'll have plastic content in the dashboards and other parts. And where's the electricity going to come from? Now, people will say, well, it will come from renewables. Well, we can meet just about our electricity demand at some days now, but if half the population or more are plugging in their electric cars every night, the demand is going to go through the roof, and that's going to be very difficult to meet. We also need to think about unintended consequences. Battery technology just isn't advanced enough at the moment. They're big, relatively big and heavy. They certainly can't be used for shipping and aviation. And they use earth minerals like cobalt and lithium, and they all need to be mined. And I'm pretty sure, well, I know that in certain areas where they're mined, there are environmental consequences, not to say very poor working conditions, and they too are finite resources. We've got developing economies who are dependent on their exports and tourism. And I'm sure I'm not the only person who agonises when they go around the supermarket, should I have these green beans because they come from Kenya, when I think of the air miles, but it means that someone's making a living. We've got to dispose of millions of gas boilers if we're going to change everyone to a heat pump or geothermal or whatever the outcome is. That's going to be a real headache. If we think about it, every industrial revolution has had unintended consequences. The Industrial Revolution was built on coal. That is what drove everything. And look at, people obviously then didn't know about the dire consequences of burning coal in those amounts. So we need to take time and think through all the knock-on effects of the decisions that we make. We're back to not being either or, it's and. We need to be sure of the consequences before we take drastic steps. One of the things you'll know that we're facing at the moment is disinvestment. We understand the sentiment behind this, but it's not as helpful as some people may think. It's certainly a strong signal for organisations, but as I've said, we are funding large parts of the transition, and the investments in carbon capture and hydrogen and other things are huge, as is the investment that's taken place in oil and gas. And they're using the funding generated from oil and gas to put into developing low carbon projects. So divesting will not in itself create meaningful change. What we'd like to see is investors engage actively with the sector, and activists actually, and constructively challenge us. Make sure that our net zero plans are satisfactory and we're held to account. We're willing to have those difficult conversations, and that is what is going to drive change. You know, oil and gas production will eventually stop. It's a finite resource, and so are the earth minerals that we're looking towards. What we've got to think about is how do we reduce the impact of oil and gas while we still need it? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Just wanted to say that thank you very much to allow us to challenge you.
We're getting used to it.
So we were going to try to do some challenging, and I would like to invite people in the room if they have questions for Alex to do that. So, and people who are online with us to come with questions through the chat box, and they will be read by Joe or by Jennifer from their side. But I have the privilege to be here with you, so I'm going to ask you the first question, okay? Or maybe the first questions. First one is, we're talking about transition. From your point of view, from the point of view of the industry, transition to what? When we transit or move on, when do we know we arrived? And you're talking about 2045. So if that is 2045, the time when we have finished our transition, I'm very worried because 2 nights ago we had with us a community from Fiji who was with us, explaining us that now, it is now where they're losing their land, they're losing their traditions, they're losing their livelihood. And I don't think they can wait until 2045. So I have these 2 questions is, how do we know we have finished the transition, we have achieved the transition, how long is it going to take, and can we really afford to wait so long?
They're great questions, and you're absolutely right, we need to be in action now, and that's why we have joined everyone else in calling for action and taking responsibility for our own emissions and decarbonising our own sector, and doing so much to contribute, we believe, to helping manage the transition. Now, the transition will mean different things to different people, but for us, our target is reaching net zero. That's the measure at the moment. But as we progress to that, and that doesn't mean that things will stop when we get there, because that's a long time away. 2045 is 24 years away. We'll be continuing in action. We'll learn more about carbon capture and other technologies, and they will become more developed. We will. This is certainly not an idea of, we've been told to do it, we'll stop at 2045/50, and then the job's done. No, this is a continuing transition as we move from an oil and gas sector into truly diverse energy sector.
Okay. And do you think we can afford 2045 or 2050? I'm thinking about the community in Fiji, for example.
Well, I'm not an expert in climate change, but certainly I would argue we need to be in action right now. We can't wait. That's both as someone from the oil sector and especially as a Christian. I think that's we cannot, and it comes back then, I think, to our own responsibility as well. If we are serious about change, we need to lead from the front and think about our own lifestyles. And we have, like it or not, a pretty material lifestyle, a very good standard of living. And it's really important, I think, that those who are in danger are given a louder voice and a bigger seat at the table.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to take a question from the room. Andrew, can you speak loud to make sure that... Oh, you're going in front of the camera. Let's go, brother.
Alex, I'd like to really thank you, because I thought that was a really thoughtful and splendid presentation. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I think you have made me think. However, there's the however. My wife chairs the Methodist Council, and the Methodist Conference this year voted to disinvest from oil and gas companies. And the reason we were given is that the oil and gas companies are not honouring the Paris Agreement. And we have somebody in the room here who was also a member of the council who made that decision. So I'm a bit confused, because I'm obviously a committed Methodist who's going to follow the conference's decision, and yet you're telling me that you're doing all the right things. Whom do I trust?
Well, I would like to know more about in what way people think that the oil and gas companies are not honouring the Paris Agreement. I don't know enough about those comments to judge. I would say I've been in the industry 30 years. I'd certainly say as well that listening to the news around COP26 has made me think too. And I'm coming back to a bogeyman comment. And we know, and we're quite sad. We don't like feeling like we're having our tobacco moment. Really, we're individuals too, and the industry is full of people who are trying to do the right thing. And I can understand where the confusion is, but what we want to do is have a more open debate, I think, because at the moment it feels like we've got activists in the street, and I admire their conviction, I really do, and it's all oil and gas is bad, renewables is good. But as I hope I've illustrated tonight, we can't just shut the taps off one day and move to renewables. That's just not going to work. And if everyone wants to give up their heating and their mobile phones and being able to get from A to B, then maybe we could look at it. I don't know if anyone saw debate night last week, but one of our trade union officers says, if you switch off oil and gas now, we'll be living in tents. Is that what you want for the next 30 years? Or, he said, turn it off now and you'll freeze more pensioners than we've done for a long time. Not the best use of words, but that's where it's coming from. For once, the trade unions or those trade unions and industry are in alignment. That's probably a meandering answer. Sorry about
that. Okay.
I'm looking for, in the room, is there more questions? Yes.
Well, thank you again for a very informative presentation. And it is nice to hear the side of the oil and gas representatives rather than hearing the anti-oil and gas representatives. I suppose if you go and live in a tent, most tents are actually made of oil, but that's another matter.
Waterproof jackets, yes, which we need in Scotland.
You mentioned on several occasions hydrogen. Now, that's all experimental at the moment. Is that where you are putting your reliance for the future?
It's one of the strands. So, as I mentioned, we're never going to be able to electrify vessels and aviation, etc. And hydrogen is an alternative fuel. So that is certainly one of the priority areas for research and development at the moment. And we've already got some hydrogen plants starting up. I'm going to say starting up, beginning to be planned. Yeah.
If I may jump on a quick, because yesterday we had a very interesting presentation from the Methodist Church in Uruguay, who was telling us that there's two types of hydrogen production. Yeah. There's a green, what they call green hydrogen, and the traditional one. Which one are you focusing on?
Both.
Both.
Yes, there'll be a need for both. So we'll need to produce blue until we have enough capacity of green. I don't know if people know the difference, but I'm not an expert in this, but I think I'll get it right. So green comes from, I think, splitting water using wind, and blue comes from splitting gas and storing the carbon capture. Storing the carbon under the sea.
I think it's what we were talking.
I think there's also black hydrogen, but I read the other day, but I'm not sure what that is.
Okay. Yeah, but it seems that from the people from Uruguay that the green hydrogen is very much experimental and that it's not efficient yet. Yeah.
No, it isn't. So blue we get from electrification. So again, you need some kind of power for the electricity, but they're both underway.
Thank you, Alex. I do believe that we have a question from the online, so I will ask Joe first and after.
Yes, thank you. This is a question from Rod. You mentioned that since 2015 the industry has been aware of emissions. Is there a measure of how the industry as a whole has reduced its carbon footprint since then?
Yes.
And if so, how successful has it been?
Right, I'm not sure I mentioned 2015, but I think it's talked about emissions reduction to 2050. But yes, we do measure our emissions. think dropped about 8% since 2019. Now, some of that will be down to reduced activity as a result of COVID, but yeah, we certainly are tracking our emissions already.
8% doesn't seem a lot, is it?
Well,
Just to put it in a context, just to put it in a scale.
yes, but if you think, I'm not sure how much you know about the offshore industry, but you've got all of these platforms. They might, they're like, I suppose, a refinery. You know, they could have 120, 180 people, and they need a lot of power to generate power generation to keep production going and keep everyone warm and the lights on, clean water, etc. But electrification that we've spoken about, being able to develop that, assuming that we can, but that's, as I say, well, the plans for that are progressing well, but are extremely costly. But that's going to take time. We're not able to do that yet. So we would expect to see probably 24, 25 electrification starting to take place.
And when do you think all the platform will be electrified?
They won't all be electrified because some of the older or smaller ones won't be commercially viable to electrify. So they won't. We'll need to look at either other means, or they may reach end of life.
End of life. Is there any plan for new platforms?
Oh, yes.
And does that mean the new platform will be electrified?
Yes, they're looking. So the one that people may be familiar with is, there's been a lot of discussion around a development west of Shetland, the Cambo field, and that's certainly looking at building in electrification if it's permitted to go ahead.
Okay. Just to confirm here, the carbon coming from the platform, what is the percentage of all the carbon coming from the industry comes from the platform?
Do you mean how big are our emissions?
Yes.
So I can't tell you what it is in tonnes.
Percentage.
A percentage, less than 3% of the UK emissions.
Okay, that's 3%. But over the oil and gas industry emission, how much a platform represent? If you
of the whole industry?
Yes.
Yes. Those would be most of the emissions, because onshore it's more, office buildings and.
So the refinery who are onshore don't produce.
Right. Sorry, I don't represent that part, so I'm not familiar with their their carbon footprint. Sorry about that.
Okay. I do believe that we have a question coming from Jennifer. Indirectly.
Indirectly, yes. It's from Liz via YouTube. So she says, thank you for the presentation. And she's got a couple of questions about Cambo. The head of Rotterdam Oil Refineries just said on BBC News, Cambo, it's better to develop the field as it means the UK will not then need to import oil. Is that true? And Sky News reported 2 days ago that Cambo would have a lot of UK taxpayers' money to develop it, but that the owner would not have to pay tax for years. Is it fair? Big business at work, etc. So that's from Liz on YouTube. So maybe.
So what was the first one? Yes, it is better to develop our own resources because as we're consuming resources, then our resources are running down. But as I've said, demand is not going to go away. So it's better that we produce our own resources to replace reserves that we've used than import them from overseas. And the second question was Cambo. Yeah, I'm really not convinced by the argument that we're often face the argument that we get government subsidies, and that isn't true. In particular, around decommissioning. But what happens is there are certain tax arrangements whereby tax is offset against the cost of decommissioning is offset against tax already paid on production. So very emotive. It's a very emotive argument that is often levelled at us, but we're not getting big government handouts. I'd go back to the level of production taxes that we've paid, and the hit that we took in 2011 in the budget.
Can you remind us what Cambo is?
Sorry, it's the field that was discovered quite a number of years ago in west of Shetland, and this actually is a good opportunity to talk about the achievements. West of Shetland, as you can imagine, is extremely rough, very deep, some very challenging wells. But where the biggest finds are at the moment. We've known about them since probably the mid-80s at least, but we haven't had the technology and the capability to develop them. But we've got a few west of Shetland fields now, and Cambo is one that is waiting for government approval to go ahead. And there are a lot of people campaigning that it shouldn't go ahead and we shouldn't have any more new oil and gas fields.
Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions online which are not repeating itself or repeating what we have discussed already? Not yet, okay. And do we have any question in the room? Okay. Oh. Budget. Okay, Derek first.
No.
Derek.
My anxiety is that you seem to be not conceiving of a time when there's petrol-driven cars and so on. And I'm told by people at the moment that we're heading towards 2.4 degrees Celsius.
Yes.
And that would, we're also told, be unbearable. So the problem as I see it, is I totally see the business about plastics and chemicals. But what I'm concerned about is the use of petrol and oil to drive vehicles and so on. There's a whole issue of the raising of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but also, in fact, the environment. So do you conceive of a time when there won't be petrol-driven cars?
Oh yes, absolutely. That seems to be the direction of travel, but we're not ready for that yet. We don't have the infrastructure in place, and as I've said, the demand for electricity, if everyone was driving an electric car at the moment, how are we going to meet that?
I think the evidence of history is that when you have a problem that needs to be solved, surprisingly, it's solved. I mean, the issue about electricity is, of course, you can't store it. What you're doing is you're making a change chemically or in some other way, and then reversing that change, and finding more efficient ways of doing that.
Thank you for this note of hope. I think we need hope in this whole debate. Jennifer, I do believe you had a pertinent question.
I do have a question. We also have a follow-up on Cambo. Sorry, the YouTube is a little bit behind.
Okay.
So that's why it's coming in now. So Liz kind of agrees that the way the press presents it can be very inflammatory. But she wanted to know about the deep sea creatures. So maybe the ecological impact around
the sponges. Yes.
Yes.
It's very interesting, my job. You hear about all kinds of things. Sponges and 400-year-old clams. Part of our industry is one of the most heavily regulated, if not the most heavily regulated, and that includes environmental regulation. So before any fields are approved, there have to be really detailed, lengthy plans. That's one of the reasons it takes a long time to get approval, which includes the environmental impact. And all of our major companies employ environmentalists to make sure that the impact is as low as we could possibly make it. So certainly that will have been taken into account in the plans which have been submitted. While we're talking about things in the sea, you might be interested to know there's a huge debate at the moment around decommissioning. So the law is at the moment that we need to remove everything. There's a lot of evidence that if you take the top sides, the bit above the water off, and take it away, over 90% of that could be recycled. Actually, I'll just put that out there. the legs that are left in the sea become artificial reefs. So there's a lot of research. There's a big debate between different parties as to what should be done there. And that's a bit of an aside, but it's a fascinating industry.
Thank you very much. I do believe that another question. Don't fight over. Jennifer again.
Yes, I have a question.
Okay, go for your question.
So when you talk about your net zero targets, are they for like the production emissions, say from the rigs and stuff, or are they also including the emissions from when oil and gas is used?
We can't manage those, so they need to be for our emissions. But we are working to contribute fully to the country's achievement of net zero.
Yeah, because I guess the carbon capture would need to be scaled up to match whatever you manage to sell, right? Yes. Is that on the cards? Scaling up that much?
To
match the amount of oil and gas you sell, to scale up the carbon capture that high, because that would be quite high, wouldn't it?
I'm not sure that you can equate the two, because the carbon will come from, it won't be coming necessarily just from our emissions. It will come from other places as well.
But it would be a floor on what you need.
It
would be a lower limit on what would be needed. Okay, no, don't worry.
Lower limit of what would be needed?
We would need at least as much carbon capture to match the emissions from, say, gas that's sold for burning.
Yes.
Not for plastics.
But that would be doable. Yeah.
Okay, that would be doable. That's good to hear.
Before I ask Julia to ask a question, I was just wanted to ask you, because I'm a little bit confused here about the market. What will be the incentive of the private companies in the oil and gas industry to put back carbon in the cave you were talking about earlier? By doing that, they're not selling to anybody. So how does it get?
No, but people will pay them to store their carbon through carbon trading schemes.
Okay, so it will be private companies, so they will make money by doing that.
Yes.
Already doing it. They're already doing it, Laurent.
Yep.
In Iceland, the Microsoft are already doing that.
But that is the plan, is to commercialize it and not expecting government to pay for doing that also.
No, there is going to need to be some government funding to get it to a commercial scale. We're working with government, as I say, on the North Sea transition deal, but otherwise, yes, it is going to become another market.
Okay.
And those are part of the things that we need to discuss with the government to make sure that we've got the right level of regulation and it will operate in a way that's manageable.
Thank you very much. Julia, I believe you had a question.
Thank you. You're representing the oil and gas industry, and I'm an environmentalist, I suppose, and therefore quite passionate about things, and therefore I'm very mindful of what I do in my behaviour. I'm just wondering, what do you do at a personal level, if that's a fair question, to limit your impact on the environment, and would you use less plastic and less travel and less?
Oh, definitely. I walk whenever I can. We've really cut down our meat consumption, recycle like mad, buy refills instead of new bottles of things. So we're very very wary, and I've got a daughter who's always sitting on my shoulder. And many of us in the industry are. It's our world too. We're worried about it for our children and our grandchildren. We have really good discussions at work, challenging our employer. What can we do to be more green? How can we recycle more waste? So, absolutely on board.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think that we are going to close our evening. Just checking that there's no burning question online, which are repeating what have already been asked. Okay, so I can see that it's a no. And I just would like to thank you very much from the bottom of my heart, because I haven't heard very much of the industry voice. And as we said when we started our conversation before the transmission, is that for us to be able to have a mature opinion, it's important to hear different voices and not to listen only to the one who's shouting the most. So thank you very much for bringing a balance within the debate. I'm sure the conversation is not finished. I'm sure there will be still argument, and that is a good thing, because the arguments are going to help us to progress.
Yes, absolutely.
And I just would like to ask, could I ask you to pray for us? And that will end our evening.
Yes, it would be a privilege. And thank you again so much for the opportunity to come and contribute to your series of events.
Thank you.
So let us pray. Creator God, we give thanks for your many abundant gifts to us, your beautiful world and everything on it and within it. We thank you for the opportunity to come together safely and peacefully to discuss how we can better care for our world and our neighbours wherever they may be. We ask that you bless all of the leaders who have been here at COP26 and those who haven't. We ask that their hearts will be open to the inequalities of wealth, health and opportunities that exist. We ask that their and our ears will be open to the cries of those in need, and that they and we will open our hands to share what we have, because we know there's enough in your world for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. You called us to be stewards of your world, Lord, yet we know we've exploited it for our own purposes. We ask that you bless all those who seek to bring about change in pursuit of healing for the world and all of creation within it. Grant that we will all think about how we can live more simply so that others may simply live. And we ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. And have a very good evening and speak to you very soon. That ends our series of talks for COP26, but it's not because COP is going to end, that ends the conversation and ends our own way of changing our life. We are all responsible, and sometimes to have boogeyman, sorry for the expression, boogeyman or scapegoats is part of cowardice to not recognize that we have our responsibility and to face our own responsibility. So we are all in it together, and we need all to change together. So have a good evening, and God bless you all. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.